Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage your moderator and distinguished panelists.
So, good, I think I can start. I've got instructions, I can start. So my name is Martin Wolf. I'm the Chief Economics Commentator of the Financial Times. And we're here to discuss everything that matters, as far as I can see, on the global economy. So a very small subject to dispose of in the next hour. Before I introduce the panelists, just to get some sense of where we are, the theme of the first chapter of the WEO this month, which I wrote about in my column this week, is that the world economy has shown resilience. We have seen a remarkably painless, given the circumstances, fall in inflation in many, many countries. And that's been something of a surprise. The cost of that has been a very welcome and really surprising extent, very, very low. But growth is disappointing, and the future does not look in general particularly bright. Furthermore, we confront enormous challenges in the world, the climate challenge above all, the threat of deglobalization, very high levels of debt almost everywhere, and a very disturbing global poverty problem, which the World Bank, among others, has written a great deal about. In this context, one of the biggest issues we all, pretty well every country I can see faces, there may be one or two exceptions, is how you deliver what the public expect and need in these areas while maintaining fiscal stability and, of course, maintaining the regained monetary stability. And all this is occurring, of course, in the context of great political stresses in many places and, needless to say, some horrendous wars. So this is a very, very challenging environment in which we are living, even though the recent past, if we look at the sort of global economy, looks rather good. Now, to discuss these issues, we have on this panel some really wonderfully diverse and interesting panel. Immediately to my left is Vera de Sousa, who's the Minister of Finance in Angola. To her left is Klaas, who is the President of the Dutch Central Bank and also the Chair of the Financial Stability Board. And I've known Klaas for a very long time. To his left is Kristalina Georgieva. Good, I've got it right for once. Who, in case you didn't know, is Managing Director of the IMF and is starting her second term. And to her left is Jean Pisani-Ferry, who I've also known for a very long time, a very distinguished French economist, and who is now non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And last, but very definitely not least, to his left is Laura Alfaro. I apologize if that's terribly pronounced, who is Warren Alpert Professor of Business Administration at Harvard University. So we've got very diverse topics and a wonderfully intellectually diverse panel. So let me start with you, if I may, Kristalina. In 3 minutes, explain what's going on in the world economy and what the core of the issues are that we should be understanding.
In 3 minutes or less. Inflation is going down. interest rates follow, and this is happening without the world economy slipping into recession. In previous inflation episodes, we were not so lucky. Why such a strong resilience? Two reasons. One, over the last decades, especially after the global financial crisis, countries have built good policies and strong institutions. And two, because policymakers talk with each other. At the IMFC, at the IMF, they talk to each other at the G20. At a time of high uncertainty, they're able to see through the fog of this uncertainty better together. But the economy is good, the mood of people is not. And the question is why? Why so much anxiety in most countries? First, inflation may be down, but high prices are here to stay. They burn a hole in the pocket of people, make them angry. Second, as you said, Martin, prospects for growth, not great, lowest in the last decades, and the burden of debt is very high. So this unforgiving combination of low growth, high debt is holding the mood down. Three, we are in a more geopolitically challenged world. We have a third year of war in Ukraine, second year of war in the Middle East, tragedy for people, but also it impacts confidence in the world, and it spills over into economic relations. Trade, for the first time, is not a driver of growth, but it is a follower. In other words, economic growth moves faster than trade. So in this environment, it is so very important that we concentrate on the #1 priority, which is boost growth and deal with that responsibly. In less than 3 minutes. Here we go.
So that lays out the challenge. It's pretty clear. May I start with you, Vera? Tell us a little bit about how you see this very challenging world from your point of view, and particularly more broadly for sub-Saharan Africa, other countries in your region, though of course they're all very different. One of the big concerns, which I've already mentioned, and Kristalina has also mentioned, is debt burdens, and fiscal management. And we understand that in many countries in the continent, and even elsewhere, the cost of debt interest has obviously risen, the fiscal cost of debt has risen, and it is squeezing out absolutely essential social services, education, and so forth, and that gives tragic choices to politics. Could you describe how you see that situation? And later on, we'll talk about some of the solutions, global and domestic. How do you see that?
Thank you. It's a huge challenge because at the same time, we need to make sure that we keep our debt sustainable, our macro environment right, but the citizens are there waiting for answers. Kristalina mentioned they are starving, young population waiting for jobs, and a lot of political and social pressure. I think a good start is to make the right choices and picking the projects that will have as much economic and social impact as possible. Because with a tight fiscal space and with limited liquidity available, we need to be very wise making choices. On top of that, we need to build internal capacity in terms of know-how, in terms of strong institutions, and in terms of tackling informality and broaden the tax base. So we need to be doing our homework just to make sure that we compensate that external challenging environment with some strength internally. For that to happen, we need to do a very real and transparent diagnosis and with technical assistance with coming from all over the world, manage to fix the situation that need to be fixed. I'm talking about, for example, regulatory framework to make possible to private sector to get in electricity and water. In some cases, it's possible with a PPP, with taking advantage of structures like MIGA, like ATIDI, establish a partnership with the private sector with a warranty to mitigate the risks. I'm talking about the fiscal environment and looking at the region of the countries that are less developed and how we can leverage fiscal benefits, but considering at the same time making sure that the economy is as digital as possible and the public administration is efficient to make sure that everybody is paying in taxes. We are talking about the efficiency of the utilities to make sure that they are not adding additional stress because the treasury do not need to keep putting money to them to stay alive. So we need to keep implementing reforms that can attract the private sector to compensate that inflows that are not so big. On the debt side, we need to look to the external debt and the internal debt. First of all, making sure that the portfolio that we already have, we can manage it in a way that is costly. Proactive debt management, liability operations, internally and externally, to reduce the costs and strengthen the line. And after that, the new debt needs to come at a reasonable cost. So managing all these always begin with good choices.
Just one very quick follow-up. Very interesting. One of the points that the WEO made, which I thought was very interesting, that there was very substantial scarring, as they put it, in particularly in developing countries, as a result of the pandemic and subsequent shocks. How far do you see that, the scarring from the past, as a central element in the challenges you now confront?
Yes, we need to keep working and building trust and leverage all the positive movement that came from that moment. During that period, we managed to close bilateral agreements with some creditors. We had the DSSI, and we also started building a strong health system. So it was a difficult moment, but it came with opportunities. And we need to leverage on those opportunities, on the partnership that we've established, on the breathing space that came from that, to continue the path of strengthening our health system, of renewing some agreements that we set the path to establish since that time in terms of debt relief and reduce of the debt burden. So I think it's possible to continue to take advantage of this.
So I'm going to turn to you, Laura. Kristalina made an interesting point that trade is not leading world growth. It's a follower, as it were. You've done a lot of work on supply chains and the reallocation of supply chains. So how far from your work would you see that there are, for many emerging and developing countries, the reallocation of trade, even if trade isn't growing, a lot of trade might shift from, say, China quite naturally and some forced elsewhere. What sort of opportunities do you see that creating, and for which countries?
So thanks for the invitation to this panel with so many amazing people. I usually like to start by saying that I consider myself a benefit of globalization. I'm a globalization child. I was born in a small open economy, little Costa Rica. I came to the US, I married someone from a different country. My life wouldn't have been possible without the benefits of this era that has been created by the World Bank, IMF, multilateralism. And so in many ways, I see with angst what's going on. I tell my students this is not helping my middle-age crisis. But on the positive side, I have to say that the world has been very resilient. We have had amazing shocks, and there's been a lot of resilience even in my part of the world, the emerging markets. And so if you are a low-income, middle-income country in Asia like Vietnam or India, or high-income country like Korea and Taiwan, you're benefiting from this reallocation. If you're a country that is close to the US, like Mexico, Canada, or even little Costa Rica, you're benefiting from this reallocation. There's also some benefits that are coming from tariff dumping FDI, which might be a way of going around the tariffs, but indeed is also bringing capital flows and a lot of resilience. And so that is, if you want, on the positive side. On the negative side, and this is also work that I have been doing with David Chor, we did the reallocation paper, but also with Maggie Chen, this survey. We have been for 5 years now serving people in the US, giving them facts about the benefits of globalization. We tell them it created jobs. We tell them it brought down prices. We tell them tariffs increase prices. We don't get them to change their minds. So there was a point that we're like, why on earth are you not changing your mind if I am showing the actual benefits of trade? And we found out that is because they cannot distinguish fears of jobs, security, and China. And what this has led is that in the US, these are real concerns that perhaps we wanted them to be addressed differently, but they have been addressed through tariffs and industrial policy. And from the small economy point of view, this has also meant perhaps the anchoring of one of the main partners in multilateralism, that is the US. And coming from a small open economy, that is the part that I fear the most. If we lost the anchor of the system, that, as I said, in general, despite the issues, I do think that is better than the alternative.
Can I just ask one follow-up on, which will fit in when we later talk, particularly to Jean and Klaas, who are Europeans. One of the senses I get, there are many differences, and most people would say the American economy is doing better than the European economy. Right? That would be a consensus view. Indeed, Mario Draghi's recent report on Europe says this. And you have just said that in America, there is great anxiety, fear of job loss and so forth, which explains the hostility to globalization. Now, Europe in many ways is similar. It's relatively open and high-income countries, but I don't get the sense that the globalization of trade, as opposed to movement of people, is a high-level anxiety in Europe. Why? I think that seems a difference, and most of us would say that's because of how the welfare states work. But do you recognize that difference, and do you understand it?
So it turns out that there's research on this, and the research documents that it first started in Europe with a country that is close to your heart, called the UK, and they chose to leave first. So I actually, again, the angst.
Right. It was about movement of people.
No, I agree. And the irony is that there's now even more movement of people, just different people.
Oh, that's another matter altogether. But gee, one of the developed countries, just come back to it because it's central, almost all the developed countries where there is large movement of people, obviously some there isn't, there's an anxiety about that. That's completely obvious. But the anxiety about trade is not so general.
No, I agree. And for example, so far in Latin America, despite what people think, Latin America has not turned against globalization.
Yeah.
So I do think there are many differences. I actually do think some angst is there in Europe. It just manifests a little bit different. But in the US, I think it has been more dramatic because the US, we always saw it as the champion of free trade. And that change has been important for many countries, but as I said, as an anchor of the multilateral system. But I agree, there's many differences in many countries.
Did you want to say something?
I just want to say, one, the US is so big that it can function pretty much even if it is not trading with the rest of the world.
Of course.
And that impacts a bit mentality. And as we know, people in the United States can spend their life traveling only in the United States, and there will be plenty of places they haven't visited yet. And the second point I want to make is that when you look at the United States and why it is outperforming Europe, there are three things that stand up. One, energy independence. Two, innovation and the ability of ideas to turn into businesses and businesses to grow. Three, with all the talk about immigration, actually, the US has plenty of access to plenty of labor, and it is making the economy perform better. So I think my generic point here is that I don't want to be understood that we have gone in the reverse gear and we are moving backwards with a high speed, because we have a slowdown in interactions of countries, but trade is like a river. You put an obstacle, it goes around it, it is not stopping, it just becomes more expensive and maybe doesn't move as much as we would like it to move. And the sense that we are interconnected is right here, because you think of services, how do you put barriers to services to flow? Because I had only 3 minutes and I had to go like boom, boom, I fear I left an impression that when we talk about interconnectivity, it is all doom and gloom. It's not great. We can do better, but we still are operating in an interconnected world. Thank you for giving me a chance to clarify.
And it is also worth noting, we may come back to that because of their nature, all the services which are digitally enabled, which are a very, very important part of trade, we tend not to focus on, are really quite difficult to stop in our current world, and they're continuing to grow. Data flows are enormous, so we must recognize that trade in goods is not all there is in trade. I'm going to turn to Jean now, and I'd like to start with a fairly broad question, which is, if you look at the European economy and your own, France, how do the challenges we've been talking about, the fiscal challenge, the growth challenges, the globalization challenges, how do they look in the European context? And what are the things that really concern you?
The difficulty we're facing at present is that, contrary to the US, we have no growth. We have no growth in productivity. The comparison with the US is dismal. I mean, since just before COVID until the latest data, productivity in the US increased by 6%, productivity in Europe increased by 2%. So we don't have growth, and that makes all the problems we're facing more difficult to solve. And on top of that, we have the energy, the cost of energy is much higher than in the US now, after the interruption of gas supplies from Russia. We have embarked on the green transition, and we want to continue, and I think the only way forward is actually to continue and speed up the green transformation, because it's a way out of our energy problem. But at the same time, we we have put in place fiscal rules that are in principle good. I think they are, the reform of the fiscal rules was well designed and put the focus on the right things. But they're too tight to, at the same time, achieve our various goals. Invest in innovation, invest in the green transition, invest in economic security, all that at the same time while keeping or actually improving our fiscal situation. So I think that's the sort of conundrum we find ourselves in. And I think the way out is that something has to give in. I think, just to transition to the more policy-oriented discussion, I think there needs to be more room for action within the fiscal rules, more room for responsible use of fiscal policy.
So I'm going to go to Klaas in a second, but I was very struck by what Vera said, and this in the context of Angola. Her reaction to the problems I raised was essentially we have to manage our public finances more cleverly. So an outside observer from Mars looking at the statistics on fiscal positions around the world would immediately notice that on average, European countries have exceptionally high ratios of fiscal spending and taxation to GDP, and your country is one of them, at the extreme level. So one reaction to what you say is not about borrowing more, it's about reallocating your already colossal spending from wasteful and useless things to productive and useful things. And that's the job that European politicians aren't prepared to take on. I suspect Klaas is smiling here. And it's an evasion to think that even more borrowing will solve the problem. How do you react to that? Rather unfriendly question, I agree.
I would say I completely agree on the situation of France. I mean, I think we have to, get our fiscal house in order. I don't agree necessarily for all countries in Europe and for the euro area in general. So I think I would distinguish sharply between what can be done at the euro level and what should be done at the French level.
So Klaas, that's sort of the opening to you. You can go beyond it, but because you're dealing with financial stability, and I want to come to that in a second. How do you see this huge sort of issue about relative growth, Europe, particularly against America, the fiscal challenges we've presented? So some people argue, and some of them are not so far from me in my organization, would argue that the reason the US economy is doing so well, yes, of course, technology is part of it, but a big reason is they gambled under both President Trump and President Biden on enormous fiscal expansion, and well, it's worked. They've got a fantastic boom. So the problem in Europe is these rules are just too restrictive, and in addition, your monetary policy is too restrictive, so of course you've got no growth. How would you respond?
Well, my first response would be that even if that were to be true for the US is, of course, enjoying the extraordinary privilege of providing the global safe asset for the world. And yeah, that means that I think the US can afford higher indebtedness, higher public indebtedness than countries that don't enjoy that same extraordinary privilege. There will always be demand for US dollars in the rest of the world, or at least as long as things are staying within reasonable limits, as long as the US economy manages to produce a reasonable amount of growth, because as you are aware, I mean, debt sustainability is more about repayment capacity than the nominal level of debt itself, and the US economy continues to generate repayment capacity. That's a little bit more of a problem in Europe for a host of reasons. We have a lower growth potential. We have a different attitude toward immigration, which I think makes it more difficult. But I think we suffer.
Bigger demographic problem.
Yeah, we have a bigger demographic problem ahead of us. We, by the way, will also have to increase spending because of security, which was already mentioned, climate, and yes, the aging of societies is also going to hit the public finances quite a bit in Europe, I would argue. So I don't think we will close the gap anytime soon with the US. But the biggest thing that I want to mention is that we suffer still quite a bit from fragmentation. And I think that the Draghi report, I think, offers some very concrete and topical examples of where we are doing ourselves a disfavor by still taking too much of a national lens through which we look at markets, activities, and the like. Whereas I think we would benefit a lot more if we took a truly European perspective and tried to reap the same scale benefits, remove some of the obstacles. I mean, if it comes to energy markets, if it comes to defense contracting, if it comes to the capital market union, set up the same amount of private risk sharing that this country enjoys and that unfortunately we don't enjoy via capital markets union, banking union, and the like. That, I think, is the challenge where we can increase our growth potential, be more innovative, and solve, or at least make our productivity problem less urgent than it currently is.
Before we move on to the most important solutions to these various challenges, I'd like to just touch upon the other area that you are responsible for, financial stability. And we've talked about nothing but problems here. I want you to assure us that it is inconceivable that there will be a major financial crisis in the next year or two, because you're completely on top of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're asking the impossible from me. I would say, however, we've lived through a period with two massive shocks, right? The pandemic, Russia's unjustifiable war of aggression into Ukraine, the energy price shock on top of it. Inflation went through the roof, and we had a massive tightening of, a synchronized tightening of monetary policy, 400, 500, 600 basis points within a matter of 12 to 14 months. That was a massive shock to the financial system, and the financial system has coped relatively well, at least on the banking side. Those banks that were subject, or that had been subject to the financial reform agenda that we rolled out after the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, those banks weathered the crisis relatively well. We had some scattered problems in the second-tier US banking industry, but those were the banks that were kept outside the financial reform agenda. And we had an idiosyncratic failure in the heart of Europe, which can always happen, and we can never give a 100% guarantee. So I would say so far so good. That doesn't mean that we still don't have a couple of financial stability problems ahead of us. The large indebtedness continues to be an issue. Public indebtedness in many countries, private indebtedness in other countries, NBFI. I mean, I don't have the time to speak about all the challenges in the NBFI space, but it's clear that the amount of resilience in the NBFI space is not yet at the same level than the amount of resilience in the banking space. And then we have the issue of geopolitical risk, geoeconomic fragmentation, and there seems to be a contrast with current market valuations. If you look at current market valuations, market participants seem to have difficulty pricing geopolitical risk. But that, of course, is a risk in and of itself, that once these risks manifest themselves, then we might have some form of correction.
What Klaas just said, if I use the IMF lingo, is we do not have a financial crisis in the baseline. Right?
Yes,
I look at our chief economist, he would confirm, we do not have a financial crisis in the baseline.
It would be very extraordinary if you did have one in the baseline, since it would suggest that you think that every one of the major central banks, finance ministries, and the IMF are clueless, which would be rather disturbing. But I think we've had a very good discussion, and I think Klaas has made a very important point, is that if we've been told in 2019 that this is what the next 5 years would look like, we would probably have said that's going to be very, very problematic, and we would expect some major bankruptcies, possibly really major fiscal crises, and they haven't happened. Yeah. And so that, and I think that is important. We should remember the things that haven't happened, because they indicate, well, maybe we did learn something from the global financial crisis after all.
We did. I very strongly believe that we did. If you look at the improvements that have happened in terms of stress testing in the financial system, in terms of collaboration across jurisdictions, you look at Basel III, all these are things that have happened. And one huge thing that we should all acknowledge and celebrate is independence of central banks.
And we must finish the agenda. That, I think, what I'm seeing from my role at the helm of the FSB is that there is some implementation fatigue gradually sort of entering into the debate. The memories of the 2008-2009 crisis gradually fade, and NBFI is a little bit more intangible issue than a bank, which is very visible, which has a solvency ratio and what have you. So, but I do think an unfinished agenda is quite dangerous, and if we want to really live up to the commitment that we gave to our people, that we would make the financial system a lot safer than it was, then we have to follow through on the promises that we made and on the things that we agreed, and implement.
So I would now like to turn to how we're going to fix the problems that remain, the really important problems. And we have, I think, enough time to focus on the biggest issues that we have identified. So I would like to start with you again, Kristalina. We've had an assessment of many problems and some genuine achievements, which I think is important. So what are the challenges ahead that really matter? How do we fix them? What should be our global priorities to fix the things that really worry you?
It is very important that today we do focus on the fiscal side. Monetary policy has delivered reduction of inflation. It has to continue to carefully monitor what is happening, because there could be a spike or there could be a risk of tightening for too long and then throwing cold water on growth. But the core attention has to be on the fiscal side because of this high debt, low growth situation, and also because spending pressures are incredibly high. Our Fiscal Affairs Department did a piece of very interesting research that says that spending pressures in advanced economies demand for the climate transition, for demographic reasons, also to meet some of the key investments in human capital critical for a new economy. 7% of GDP in addition to what are current spending. In emerging market economies, 9%. This is by 2030. In low-income countries, 14%. So if you think about the fiscal issue, it is on one side debt needs to be reduced, and on the other side, there has to be space for priority spending that currently doesn't exist. So how do we deal with this? Again, in the work we have done in the fund says, one, put your plan for fiscal consolidation over time in place. Two, rationalize your spending. As we heard from Vera, do not waste money on things that you shouldn't waste money on. You would ask me, what is an example? Well, fossil fuel subsidies. We can save tons of money if we eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. 5% of GDP would come from there. But then, of course, look at how can you increase growth. And what are the structural reforms that are going to, over time, deliver, by 2030, deliver the fiscal space you need. And there it is also very interesting because we looked at countries, and there are just about 20 countries that have been very successful in doing exactly that. Prioritize, create space, move forward. So if we get all countries to aim to be as good as the best in class, then we actually can move towards higher growth. You talked about the EU. I mean, we all know that the European Union has to complete the single market. Everybody knows it. So, for God's sake, complete it. Get on with the job. So what we want to communicate is a sense of urgency. Unless we get growth up, and do that in a sustainable manner, I don't see how we are going to move the mood of people up. And again, it is possible. It has been done. It is not something, it's not fairy tale. The issue is, of course, Vera would tell us, probably you're the one here that is being elected. How do you get re-elected when you do all the things that are necessary to inject more dynamism in your economy?
Can I turn to you, Vera? One of the issues, I don't want to get away for the moment from the woes of Europe and monetary and fiscal policy, we'll come back to this, but I'm very interested, your country is a significant oil exporter. And a very large part of the agenda people are talking about, admittedly they talk much more than they do anything about it, is climate. And that obviously creates some rather large challenges from your point of view. How do you see the role of countries like yours in the process of discussing this and delivering a climate management program for the world?
Yeah, our strategy is based on focusing first on the power generation, electricity. So we are moving with an agenda where we are progressively increasing our clean sources of energy. Hydro, solar, we are now in the position of producing more than we need. And the next step is to take advantage of it, to interconnect with the parts of the country that do not have access to that electricity, and right after that export to the neighboring country. That's why in my first intervention, I mentioned how much important it was for us to move with a reform of open the transmission line for the private. So energy, we understand it's a good start. So we managed to decrease around 40% the use of, how I can say in English, the energy coming from burning diesel. We managed to reduce it. We will finish in 2027 our third dam, Kakulu Kabasa. We have huge solar plants being put in place. So a strong investment that we are doing, and we believe that in 2027, we will have more than 60, near to 70% of our electricity coming from clean sources of energy, hydro and solar mainly. After that, because we will continue, and we are moving in parallel, because we understand that we will continue having the oil companies there, what we are challenging them, and they are responding, is for them to have a strategy for them to continue working when the oil finished, because that moment will come. So they already started looking at gas, biofuel, and we have some deals being signed on that perspective. So that's our strategy, and we will continue calibrating it along the way.
That sounds very impressive and very significant and far-sighted, more so than most as far as I can see, so congratulations.
Thank you.
I'd like to turn to you, Laura. So I've been asked to ask you, and I always do what I'm told, actually no, but never mind, to talk about from your past in government. And one of the themes here, very much a theme of this year's WEO, is how do you get the public to accept the reforms that are needed, or the fiscal tightening, even worse, that are needed? What does your experience tell you about how you manage that in democracies? How do you manage the process of reform and adjustment where it is necessary without having the politics blow up in front of you?
So it's funny, I have to talk about this because we did manage to pass a tax reform, but our Supreme Court brought it down for process. So what is that for? Like, you go through the whole process and then...
Supreme Courts are such a problem.
So, but I want to take a little bit of the detour because it was mentioned the lessons that Europe learned. I want to mention that Latin America, we have also learned lessons.
Yes, exactly.
We used to be the countries of the crisis in the 80s and the 90s, and some still are, but many have learned. And so Latin America was the first to increase interest rates because we had independent monetary policy, and we have very sound financial systems. I'm talking here about Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Chile. And all of this was learned through crisis. Not all learn through all crises, some take a little bit more crisis to learn. But I have to say that reforms are very personal. There is a very nice quote by, I think, Schumpeter that says, all of the history, all of the norms, all of the culture are written in a country's fiscal history because it's very personal. But I do believe a little bit in the tough love of the IMF. I do think that in particular, for example, fiscal rules can work. I have research that shows that a fiscal rule can be optimal. Not all fiscal rules are optimal. Some, especially if they're flexible. And there are examples that they have worked in Latin America, even in countries that are complicated, and Jamaica is one example. I had to recently discuss a very nice paper by Aikengreen and Peter Henry and Arslapan, and I just mispronounced his last name, where crisis came, they tried, they couldn't do it. Eventually, the country came together, but they had the tough love of the IMF that allowed them to push and continue. And I think what the Jamaica case also shows is that development is never over. I think there is this idea that one day you reach it, and that doesn't exist. Every day you have to work for it. I think the rich countries have realized that, but for us it's also true. So just to convey more than we're not done. Every day we have to do it, and that's how we get the benefits. But as I said, it's very personal. It's very hard to generalize from one country to the other one.
There's one question, and before we look a bit more at the European experience together, because it's very interesting. But one question that arises out of the current situation, Klaas particularly, and I think Jean will have a view, maybe others will too. But I've been thinking about the desire, which is pretty clear in the IMF's fiscal monitor report, basically to do fiscal adjustment, fiscal tightening, as a sort of general proposition. And with higher interest rates, that makes sense, obviously. Other things being equal, that will put more of the burden of macroeconomic expansion or stabilization on lower interest rates. You would expect that. If there is a genuine shift, general shift in that direction, tighter fiscal policy, looser monetary policy, could that be an environment in which financial stability becomes more of a concern? Yeah, so what do you think?
I mean, that's of course quite speculative. I mean, I would first say there's of course also a positive twist to the policy coordination scenario that you were describing, which is that lower interest rates will give governments the fiscal space to actually
indeed, that's the other side of the same thing. I mean,
and lower interest rates will only be decided by the inflation outlook, and the inflation outlook at this moment is moving, or has been moving, in a favorable direction. We're pretty confident on the return to price stability in many of the countries, not just in the euro area, I would say. So that positive attitude is there. Yes, we will have to deal in the coming years, in our projections, in our economic outlook, with the fact that fiscal policy will be consolidating. I mean, the challenge in France is not just fiscal consolidation in 2025, it's consolidation in 26, 27, 28, 29. So that means that indeed, normally speaking, that will have a declining impact also on the inflation outlook, should lead to lower interest rates. The question then is, how does the financial sector go about these lower interest rates? Will that again give rise to a search for yield, build up of financial instability risks and the like? I would hope that we have learned some lessons from the low for long period, the fact that the banking system is already more robust than it has been for a long time. But then again, we still have the market-based finance space, which is now more than 50% of all financial assets in the world. And there, I do think we still have to strengthen the liquidity management of the entities there within that space in order for these risks not to become a financial stability event going forward.
Now, John, if I may come back to some of the issues we discussed before in the challenges. The Draghi report, which is obviously very helpful in crystallizing some of the issues in terms of a growth strategy for Europe, a development strategy. It called for very substantial increases in investment. I think that, if I remember, 800 billion euros is a figure. Everybody knows, looking at round, that defense security is likely to become more expensive. The societies are aging, and there are expenditure increases from there. And then there are initial conditions, which in many countries, as Klaas is suggesting, will require fiscal consolidation. This really does look like an immense set of political challenges. And I'm just interested in two questions there. The first, do you think there is any plausible possibility that Kristalina talked about completing the single market, that there will be agreement at any stage on doing some of this through a European fiscal setup, an expansion of the fiscal capacity, the common fiscal capacity, which happened very briefly it happened not briefly, but it happened during the pandemic, and now obviously there's tremendous debate. And the second point is, if that doesn't happen, that sharing doesn't happen, that obviously implies much bigger adjustment for some countries than others, many of them in greater political difficulty. How difficult do you think that is going to be for over the next few years, given the objectives on the one hand and the fiscal constraints that are going to operate in certain countries on the other?
Okay, you're ending with the easy question. Let me say, on the Draghi report, I'm happy you mentioned it. The Draghi report was prepared recently, was handed over to the Commission, the European Commission, with a very dark diagnosis of the situation of Europe, and this diagnosis has not been disputed. So everybody is saying Draghi is right, but then comes the question of what to do.
Yeah.
And the question of what to do, he essentially advocating making use of European integration, which is what you advocated, Klaas, but also saying we've got to spend more and we've got to invest more. And the numbers are just the numbers he's putting forward. Actually, I think they were prepared also with the help of the fund. It's 5% of GDP over several years in order just to change gear. And I think he's right. He's right with the prescription, but it's not going to come, out of the blue without any policy implication. So you're right. One of the solutions would be to go for a European fiscal capacity, which, by the way, as a prerequisite, implies that there needs to be own resources for the EU to be able to repay its debt. I mean, in 2020, there was a decision to go to borrow jointly, with the commitment that fiscal revenues would be created, what we call own resources, but nothing has happened, so which is completely irresponsible. So I think the first thing would be to get an agreement on how to finance the EU budget. And then the next thing would be how to use this capacity. And here I think it comes back to what we discussed earlier on the costs for defense, the costs for the transition, the costs for innovation. And those are private costs, but they're also a fiscal dimension. So my take would be, we have better fiscal rules, and it's an investment. This investment should be mobilized also to create space, to enlarge the space there is for fiscal action at European level.
Well, the clock tells me we have 1 minute and 33 seconds. Kristalina, is there one point you want the audience to take away from our discussion?
Well, I do. You are always welcome to come to the IMF for some tough love.
With a very strong emphasis on the first word. I knew that this was going to be a very, very wide-ranging discussion, and I'm particularly aware that we have not discussed, for obvious reasons, the possibility that a year from now we will be in a first-class global trade war. And we have not discussed, I think, fully, because it's really a whole theme of its own, what we do with our climate crisis. But we do, I think, have had a very rich discussion of most of the other issues confronting the world economy, at least many of them. And particularly, I think we've had a really lucid and interesting discussion of the political challenges that are confronting governments now, because after a long period of crisis and adjustment, we are now in a situation, along with aging and other such changes, in which many, many countries face extraordinarily difficult fiscal challenges. And in the end, politicians can't operate and countries can't operate if they don't have fiscal room for maneuver. That's a necessary condition. And I was reminded when I used to work over there at the World Bank, and I started my career, that the words IMF always stood for it's mostly fiscal, and therefore I'm sure the IMF will be very happy to know it remains mostly fiscal. Thank you, thank the panel, and thank you for listening.